It's amazing how a quiet morning can turn into a circus in less than a minute, especially when you look up from your coffee and see a furious HOA president with her luxury SUV skewed across your driveway, 2 front tires hissing and sagging on the spike trap you installed the night before. Karen was out of the driver's seat, arms flailing like she was trying to swat a swarm of invisible bees, her voice hitting that glass-shattering pitch as she screamed that I had no right to block community access with my gate, that this was technically shared property, and I would be fined into bankruptcy. I leaned against the porch railing, sipping slow, partly for the drama and partly to hide my grin, because the sheriff was already on the way, and I knew the scene was only going to get better from here. To understand how we got here, you'd have to go back 3 days earlier, when the HOA board called a vote to install what they called a public access gate across my private driveway. The reason, they claimed, was to allow neighbors to shave 4 minutes off their drive to the highway. The real reason, as Linda later told me in a whispered phone call, was that Karen was tired of driving the long way around when visiting her friend who lived on the far side of my property. I was at that meeting in person, leaning against the back wall while Karen paced like a dictator in a poorly lit town hall, firing off words like community safety, mandatory access, and the greater good, her eyes scanning the room for approval like a shark circling for blood. Every other board member nodded along, not because they believed her, but because no one wanted to deal with her wrath if they disagreed. I raised my hand and calmly asked how much of my private land the HOA thought they owned. The answer, it turned out, was all of it. They didn't even have the paperwork to back it up, just a vague claim about historic use, and a few dusty maps. So I told them what I thought in terms they could understand. Not going to happen, not now, not ever. That was the first time I saw Karen's smile fade into the kind of expression that said she was already imagining 50 ways to ruin me. By the time I got home that night, I'd already made up my mind to protect my property in a way that would make any attempt to push past my gate a very bad idea. I called Mark, who lives 2 roads over and works as a mechanic, and by the following afternoon we had installed a set of retractable spike strips just behind my front gate. The system was simple but effective. Roll forward without clearance and you'd be calling a tow truck before you even realized what happened. We positioned the warning signs in plain sight, bright red, bold letters, private property keep out, but Mark and I both knew Karen wasn't the type to respect signs, rules, or other people's boundaries. The real entertainment would come from her ego walking her straight into the trap. Sure enough, the very next morning Linda texted me from her kitchen window, telling me Karen had been in the HOA group chat bragging that she was going to test my gate and make a point about how unnecessary my security measures were. I put on coffee, settled into my chair, and opened the porch blinds just in time to watch her pull up at full speed, the front of her SUV kissing the gate for a split second before the unmistakable pop-pop-pop of steel spikes chewing through rubber cut through the morning air. The thing about Karen is she never does anything quietly. She slammed her door so hard the sound echoed off the trees, her heels clicking on the gravel as she stormed to the gate, waving her phone like it was a sword. She yelled about calling the sheriff herself, about how she would have my gate removed, about how she would bill me for the damage. I didn't bother pointing out that she was standing directly under 2 different cameras clearly recording the scene from multiple angles. I just sipped my coffee and watched her try to argue with physics, pacing around the front of her car as if staring at the shredded tires would magically put them back together. When she spotted me, she launched into an even louder rant about how the HOA had declared my road community infrastructure, and how she'd already scheduled a contractor to remove the gate next week. I didn't tell her I'd already spoken to the sheriff about the HOA's overreach, or that the county had confirmed my driveway was legally mine and always had been. Sometimes you let the storm blow itself out before you bring in the lightning. Minutes later, the sound of a familiar engine signaled the arrival of Sheriff Daniels, who pulled up in his dusty pickup, hat tilted low and a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. He stepped out, gave me a nod, and turned to Karen with the sort of patience you only see in someone who has dealt with the same problem for years. She launched into her story about malicious traps and dangerous obstructions, pointing at me like I'd personally taken a chainsaw to her tires. Daniels listened without interrupting, then asked if she had noticed the warning signs. She said the signs were irrelevant because the HOA had jurisdiction here, a claim that made him chuckle. Then he asked if she'd like to see the county records proving otherwise. Her jaw tightened, and she muttered something about her rights before stomping back toward her car. The problem was, her car wasn't going anywhere without new tires, and the tow truck was at least 40 minutes out. Daniels suggested she might be more comfortable waiting at home, but Karen refused to leave her SUV behind, claiming I might tamper with evidence. He raised an eyebrow and glanced at me, and I had to bite back a laugh. For the next half hour, we stood there in an awkward standoff. Karen pacing and muttering into her phone, Daniels leaning against his truck with the casual patience of a man who knew exactly how this would end, and me sipping coffee like I was watching the best reality TV episode of the year. When the tow truck finally arrived, the driver's expression said it all. He'd been here before, probably more than once, and he knew exactly who he was dealing with. As he hooked up the SUV, Karen kept up a running commentary about legal action, HOA bylaws, and how I'd regret ever crossing her. I let her talk, because in my experience the more Karen talked, the more she revealed. She let slip that the HOA had already approved a motion to redirect my driveway for community use, even though it wasn't on their land. That was all I needed to hear to know this wasn't going to be a one-time incident. This was the opening move in a much bigger game, and if Karen thought I was going to back down, she was in for a long, painful lesson in what happens when you pick the wrong property owner to mess with. As the tow truck pulled away, Daniels gave me a knowing look and said we'd be talking soon, and I knew then that the real fight hadn't even started yet, but I was ready for it. By the next morning, word had spread faster than gossip at a church potluck, and it was obvious Karen wasn't going to lick her wounds in private. My phone buzzed at 8 a.m. with a message from Linda that simply read, "Emergency meeting at 9, followed by 3 laughing emojis, and I knew exactly what kind of circus was about to unfold. I showed up to the HOA clubhouse just in time to see Karen striding across the parking lot in oversized sunglasses and a scarf like she was hiding from paparazzi, her walk all business but her eyes darting to make sure everyone noticed her arrival. Inside, the board members sat at a long folding table covered in neat stacks of paper that I suspected were mostly for show, and as soon as I took a seat at the back, Karen banged a gavel like she was presiding over the Supreme Court. She launched into her opening monologue, painting herself as a victim of a premeditated act of aggression by a homeowner who refused to cooperate with the community's needs, her tone quivering just enough to make it sound like she had barely survived some kind of traumatic ambush. She claimed I had installed illegal devices designed to cause bodily harm, that my gate violated HOA bylaws about open access, and that I had personally endangered families and pets. A few members nodded solemnly, while others glanced sideways as if they had heard this performance before. I sat still, watching the theater play out, and waited for the moment when Karen's ego would lead her straight off the stage. That moment came when she demanded a unanimous vote to fine me heavily until the gate was removed. She had barely finished speaking when the door at the back opened and Mark walked in, casual as ever, carrying a small projector and a mischievous grin. Without asking permission, he set it up, dimmed the lights, and projected dashcam footage onto the far wall. The video showed Karen's SUV cruising up my driveway past multiple private property signs before hitting the gate and shredding her tires, followed by her dramatic exit from the car. The footage was crystal clear, and the audio picked up every shouted word about how she was making a point and proving a lesson. Mark paused the video on her mid-shout, mouth wide open, hands in the air like a soap opera villain caught mid-scene, and then asked the room if anyone still thought this was an accident. A couple of board members looked down at their papers, a few smirked, and Karen's face flushed so red I thought she might actually burst. She sputtered something about context and unfair framing, but Mark just shrugged and hit play again, letting the whole room hear her brag about ignoring my warnings. Linda, bless her, chose that moment to chime in from the side, announcing that she had screenshots from the HOA group chat where Karen had openly bragged about driving onto my property to show him who's in charge. She read them aloud in a tone so sweet you could almost miss the sting, each message painting Karen not as a victim but as a self-appointed enforcer of rules that didn't even apply to my land. Karen tried to regain control of the meeting, pounding the gavel again and insisting that the real issue was my unwillingness to contribute to community harmony, but the damage was done. A couple of the quieter board members finally spoke up, asking whether the HOA even had legal authority over my property in the first place. Karen brushed the question aside, claiming that historic precedent gave them rights, but she had no documents to prove it. I watched her scramble, pulling random files from the neat stack in front of her that turned out to be unrelated budget reports and landscaping schedules. The meeting began to unravel as people whispered to each other, clearly more interested in the scandal of the footage than in enforcing Karen's agenda. Mark packed up the projector and gave me a little salute as he walked out, leaving Karen to flounder without her audience fully on her side. Still, I knew Karen wasn't the type to take public embarrassment as a cue to retreat. In fact, humiliation seemed to be her fuel. As the meeting wound down with no vote taken, she fixed me with a glare that could have curdled milk and announced that further action would be taken against me before the week was out. I didn't bother asking what that meant, because with Karen, threats were as common as her over-accessorized scarves, and they usually came with more drama than substance. I left the clubhouse to find Linda waiting outside, phone still in her hand, grinning like a cat that had just knocked something expensive off a shelf. She told me she'd overheard Karen on a call after the meeting, instructing someone to get a truck ready and bring the heavy chains. It didn't take much imagination to guess she was planning to physically remove my gate, and knowing Karen, she'd probably try to make a spectacle of it. On the drive home, I mulled over my options. I could call Sheriff Daniels preemptively and have him on standby, but something about the idea of watching Karen run headfirst into another one of my setups was too tempting to resist. That afternoon, I called Mark and explained what Linda had overheard, and we spent the next couple of hours reinforcing the gate's frame with a hidden steel crossbar and extra anchor bolts sunk deep into the concrete. If she wanted to pull it down, she was going to need more than a chain and a truck. She was going to need a miracle. We even mounted an extra camera to capture the moment from the best possible angle, because if Karen wanted a public confrontation, I was happy to provide the footage. That night, as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the trees, I thought about how quickly things had escalated. 3 days ago, the HOA's biggest concern had been whether the community pool needed new umbrellas. Now we were on the verge of a full-blown property war, with Karen as the self-appointed general of a one-woman army. I had dealt with her type before, people who believed rules existed for everyone but themselves, people who mistook stubbornness for strength, and I knew the only way to beat them was to stay 3 steps ahead. The difference was, Karen wasn't just stubborn. She was creative in all the wrong ways, and that meant I couldn't underestimate her. Somewhere out there, she was plotting her next move, and if I knew her at all, she wouldn't wait long to try it. What she didn't realize yet was that every step she took made it easier for me to turn the tables, and by the time this little feud was over, she'd have a lot more than a couple of flat tires to worry about. By mid-morning the next day, the first rumblings of Karen's next offensive began to echo through the neighborhood, and it started the way most of her plans did, with a suspicious convoy of vehicles rolling slowly past my driveway like they were casing the place for a heist. The first was a tow truck, shiny and overbuilt for residential streets, followed closely by Karen's freshly repaired SUV, which still had faint scrape marks along the front bumper from her spike trap encounter. Behind them was a battered pickup loaded with chains, a generator, and what looked like some sort of portable winch. I didn't have to guess twice about their plan. She was going to forcibly remove my gate